Well, on Thursday, I exchanged emails with somebody in the office. You know, when you complain about somebody in the office and you say, the office, that's a more polite way to complain. I thought was sort of intriguing and maybe provocative title, and I thought it might appear in the Friday afternoon email, but it wasn't there. And then I thought it might appear in the Shabbat announcement booklet, but it wasn't there. So I have to tell you the title of my sermon. The title is Rabbi Abramson, Rabbi David, Dave, Does It Matter? That's the title. See, it's written right here. So now that you know the title, so let's deal with let's get some of the details out of the way. First, Dave. Once, many years ago, a roommate called me Dave and then apologized, and I didn't know why he was apologizing. And he said, "Oh, I thought you didn't like being called Dave." Well, no. I mean, I don't use Dave like in first person, but my parents sometimes called me Dave, and my wife did, and my sisters do. And even one of the guards at JTS called me Dave. I'd come in the gates and I'd say hi, and he'd say, okay, Dave. So people call me Dave. Rabbi Dave sounds a little too cool for my taste. Hey, Rabbi Dave, we're having some great times today. Okay. So what about Rabbi David? I'm not crazy about Rabbi David either, and I have two objections. One is historical, because, you know, we conservative rabbis steeped in Wissenschaft des Judentums love historical explanations. The title Rabbi, followed by a first name, is a feature of centuries past, when people didn't use surnames as we do. So we know Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir and so on. On the other hand, I'm inclined to associate the name Rabbi David with a rabbi whose surname is David. But the other reason I don't favor Rabbi David is because of Robert Young. Yes, Robert Young. Remember Father Knows Best? Well, some of you might remember Marcus Welby, MD, which was Robert Young's second TV series. And even when I was in high school, I knew what an awful, insipid show it was. And I didn't even know the word insipid at that point. And Robert Young and James Brolin, who played Dr. Welby's young associate, were known to their young patients as Dr. Mark and Dr. Steve. And just thinking about that show almost makes me rich. So another reason for me not to like Rabbi David. So I prefer, in rabbinic settings, to be called Rabbi or Rabbi Abramson. Which brings me to the real ikar of my sermon today, why some rabbis prefer to be called by their professional titles and surnames, and others are fine being called by their first names. It might be partly a generational thing. Maybe more rabbis of my vintage prefer title and surname, while more younger rabbis might prefer first names, but I think that generational divide is certainly not universal. Now, some might think that my preferring Rabbi Abramson to David is a matter of pomposity. I know some of you are thinking, Abramson pompous? No. And others are thinking, Abramson pompous? But it's not about pomposity versus humility, not simply about formality versus informality. There's something else going on here. One of my favorite episodes of The West Wing is one in which Deborah Fitterer gets the job as executive secretary to President Bartlett. Fitterer is played by the brilliant Lily Tomlin. Toward the end of the episode, Fitterer is on thin ice, having previously written a letter to the editor advocating putting arsenic in President Bartlett's water in protest of a policy decision with which she had disagreed. Now, you can't threaten the president's life or threaten something else similarly heinous and expect to get a job in the White House afterwards, at least not in the Bartlett White House. But the scene begins with President Bartlett telling Fitterer that she's got the job anyway. And Fitterer is a little dumbfounded. She asks why. The president begins by opening up his briefcase and taking out a paper and reading from the infamous letter. Let's stick some arsenic in President Bartlett's drinking water and see if he delegates responsibility to the World Bank then, he reads. And then he looks up at Fitterer. President Bartlett, you referred to me and to the office with respect. You're a class act. And with a flourish of Tomlin's comedic genius, the scene ends. And Lily Tomlin will go on to be a crucial cast member in one of the two best dramatic series in television history.
The other being Star Trek.
No, the other being The Wire, but I digress. I love that scene not only because of the terrific acting of Lily Tomlin and Martin Sheen, and not only because of Aaron Sorkin's wonderful writing, but that scene was more than simply part of a well-written and well-acted television episode. When I first saw it, it made an instructive impression on me. It reminded me that sometimes titles are important because rituals are important, because symbols are important. The time that after I first saw the episode, I began referring to George W. Bush as President Bush, and to former presidents by their titles as well. And it affected how I viewed and felt about those presidents and how I viewed and felt about the presidency. Now today, of course, there are differences of opinion about how Donald Trump should be referred to or addressed in courtrooms. There are those who believe that as a former president, he should retain that honorific, while others believe that he should not. Titles do matter. So one day in 1980, when I was home for summer vacation during rabbinical school, Rabbi Leonard Kahan, Zichrono Livracha, who had been my mentor in my college years, gave me a cassette of a recording made at that year's Rabbinical Assembly Convention. Conventions Cassettes Unlimited did a booming business at RA conventions in those days. And this was a recording of a presentation by Rabbi Jack Bloom entitled Dynamics of the Rabbinate. Rabbi Kahan told me to listen to the tape, to play it for my parents, and one day to play it for my future fiancé, as he explained, so that you and they will understand what you're getting yourself in for. Of course, I already knew a lot about the rabbinate, I told myself, from undergraduate Judaic studies classes, from my synagogue work during those years, and certainly with a couple of years of rabbinical school behind me, I'd become adept at expounding on what I perceived to be my modern understanding of the rabbinate, my historically correct understanding of the rabbinate. I knew, for example, that according to normative halacha, there really is nothing that a rabbi does that cannot be done by a non-rabbi. One doesn't have to be a rabbi to lead a congregation in prayer. One doesn't have to be a rabbi to teach or to provide pastoral care. I also knew that the title Rav, from which the English word rabbi comes, means teacher. And historically, that was one of the primary roles of the rabbi. Traditionally, we didn't rely on rabbis to lead us in prayer. We had other people, different kinds of shlichei tzibur. Traditionally, there are some prayers that only Kohanim can recite, but no prayers that only a rabbi can recite. And I knew that rabbis were not priests. We'd had priests, the Kohanim. We'd outgrown the priesthood and the sacrificial system, and a new kind of leader emerged, not from a hereditary priesthood, but from the people. Priests, including the ancient Kohanim, were intermediaries between people and God, and as Judaism developed, this role of spiritual intermediary was replaced by this different kind of leadership, rabbinic leadership. Well, all that I had learned about the real rabbinate was accurate, but Jack Bloom's presentation made me begin to learn that there was much more to it. Jack Bloom graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1959 and began an illustrious career as a pulpit rabbi. But after some years, he reported, I found myself isolated and alone, living behind a glass wall. Tired of the burdens of the pulpit rabbinate, the burdens on him and on his family, he quit the pulpit rabbinate. He went to Columbia University and earned a PhD in psychology, and his doctoral research was, among other things, his attempt to figure out What had gone wrong? Bloom's doctoral work led him to a new understanding of the rabbinate, in which the rabbi is a symbolic exemplar. A symbolic exemplar. The rabbi, Bloom said in his presentation, is the symbol of something other than himself. And the pulpit rabbi is a symbolic leader who is set apart to function within his community as a symbol of that community and as an exemplar of that community's desire for moral perfection. The rabbi is a walking, talking, living symbol and stands for something other than himself. And by the way, I should note that Bloom was writing during a time when conservative rabbis were only men. This different status in the community, this symbolic exemplarhood, can place burdens, including unfair burdens, on the rabbi and the rabbi's family. The rabbi's religious observance is often scrutinized and judged by congregants, and this scrutiny isn't limited to the synagogue. The grocery store or the drugstore can also be a locus for such interaction, and many rabbis know very well their congregants' furtive glances into their shopping carts or the occasional complaint that the rabbi wasn't friendly enough when rushing through CVS. There are things that rabbis are expected to do, and there are things that rabbis are not allowed to do. Now, some of you may know that my comic idols include Charlie Chaplin and Groucho Marx, and of course, Richard Pryor. But I can't do most of my favorite Richard Pryor routines anymore, at least not here and not with you. And rabbinic life can be burdensome for a rabbi's spouse and children as well. The specific expectations and roles of a Rebbitzin were different when my grandmother became one in 1920 in comparison to when my wife became a Rebbitzin in 1984. But being a rabbinic spouse is still complicated, and being the child of a rabbi can be tough as well. Are boisterous or rebellious rabbis' kids judged more harshly than other kids in a congregation? Yes, indeed. Schwer zu sein, a rabbi's kid. These are the downsides of the rabbinate, of being a symbolic exemplar. But here's the thing. It's also the key to the rabbi's role and the rabbi's success. It is your symbolic exemplarhood, Rabbi Bloom said in that presentation to rabbis in 1980, which makes your words count. It is your symbolic exemplarhood that makes it possible for you to do your work and the work of changing the future of the American Jewish community. It is the source of your power. In my 10 years as a congregational rabbi, he continued, I did more important work, affected more lives, changed more people, and made more Jews than I will in the rest of my career. I know that it was me and my symbolic exemplarhood role in the end that changed and moved these people. By the way, not everybody embraces Bloom's thesis of the rabbi as symbolic exemplar. The other day, I raised the topic on my rabbinic listserv. Rabbi Jack Moline was one of the colleagues who responded. And Rabbi Moline reported, I had cause to reference symbolic exemplar with a younger colleague very recently. I received an eye roll and some version of, okay, boomer. And I have two responses for this rabbinic whippersnapper, whoever he or she is. Number one, Jack Bloom was right. And number two, get off my lawn. So let's get back to names and titles and symbols and relationships. Of course, rabbis do have friendships within their congregations, in many cases deep and intimate and meaningful friendships. Some such friends call their rabbi by his or her first name in private, but prefer to use the rabbinic title in public. Not necessarily because the rabbi insists on that public formality, but often because the congregants have an intuitive sense that the rabbinic title helps to concretize the rabbi's role in the congregation. Just last night, Alan was asking me about my sermon title for this morning, and without the title in front of me, which turns out it wouldn't have been in front of me anyway, I gave him some version of the title, and Alan said, well, of course you're rabbi here. But if you and I were to go out for a beer, you might be David. To put it another way, calling one's rabbi by his or her professional title helps the rabbi and the congregant to embrace the rabbi's role as symbolic exemplar and can enhance the rabbi's spiritual effectiveness in the congregation. Ultimately, it's not primarily about titles. So if you call me Rabbi David, I won't correct you. If you call me David, I won't insist on rabbi, and if you call me rabbi, I won't insist on phony informality. What's important, I think, is that we, rabbis and non-rabbis, grow in understanding and appreciation of the role of the rabbi as symbolic exemplar. It is one of the keys to a rabbi's success, and I think it is crucial to the spiritual growth of rabbis and congregants as well. Shabbat Shalom and Moadim L'Simcha.